morning. Welcome. Super glad that you are here with us. As Emily said, we are in the third week of a series that we've been calling Isn't She Lovely? We've been looking at the church, the bride of Christ, as a lovely, truly beautiful entity in the world. And I recognize, and we've said through this series, that people's experience with church can look a lot of different ways, not just this church, but like the church kind of globally. And sometimes the church hasn't always lived up to that beautiful, lovely ideal that Jesus represented for us. And so while we acknowledge that, this series is all about the hope that is the church and the beauty that can be the church. And so I hope, as in the last few messages in this series, that today you will find some encouragement, some inspiration that perhaps just reignites your understanding or your sort of fresh look at the local church. Isn't she lovely? So a couple of weeks ago, I want to encourage you, go back on YouTube or on our website if you didn't catch these messages, but a couple of weeks ago, Josh started this series with the idea that at its best, the church exists as the context for spiritual formation, right? This whole idea of spiritual community, spiritual growth, the church sits at the center of that, right? So we looked at that in our first week. And then the second week, Josh talked about the mission of the church. And he said, really, the mission of the church is to diligently live out the great commandment to love God and love others, and the great commission to go and make disciples throughout the world, teaching them the ways of Jesus. And so these were the kinds of things that Josh brought to us last week and said, hey, the mission of the church is this beautiful combination of the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. And so today I want to take that one step further, and I want to share with you today this idea that the church sits poised to serve both the physical and spiritual needs of our communities with radical generosity. We're going to look at generosity today, and here's an important disclaimer. You can rest easy and you don't have to hold on to your wallets for this message, okay? This is not a please give Verve City Church more money kind of message. This is not that message, because the church, isn't she lovely? When we look at the beauty and the opportunity that we have as the church to bless the world, that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at Jesus's model and examples throughout the scriptures of radical generosity, just being an amazing blessing in our community. And so this isn't necessarily a message that has like immediate personal implications for you. We're not taking up a special collection at the end of today's message. We're not about to be in a capital campaign or anything like that. This is truly an opportunity to like reflect on what can we see in Scripture and Jesus' teaching that allows us to live a life of beautiful generosity, because isn't that a lovely life? And so as we get started, I want to look at a quote by a couple of folks, Chris Willard and Jim Shepard, who do a lot of work in sort of church-based thinking around philanthropy. And they write this. They write, "Ministry to others is the visible fruit of faith, God's way of helping us to establish a connection with other human beings and ultimately bring them to an encounter with His life-giving grace." Basically, what they're summing up is this idea that when we sit at the intersection of the Great Commandment and the Great Commission, our generosity through a local church helps bring other people, what? Into relationship, an encounter with Jesus. And that's what we hope, right? When we talk about our mission to help people find life by following Jesus, we're excited to be in ministry to others for the purpose of helping them find that encounter with Jesus. And why do we do this? Well, if we go all the way back to the actions of the early church, the earliest Jesus followers were literally following Jesus' example that they had seen him do during his life and his ministry time here on earth. So Jesus himself, right, took time and paid attention to people who others in society would have considered outcast or unworthy of even his attention or notice, right? Jesus took time. Jesus demonstrated what it looked like to share blessings with others, right? He literally would sit and share a meal in someone's home. Jesus did this again and again. And so when the early church begins to put into practice the life, really, and the example of Jesus, we see the earliest church doing some of these very same things. A couple of weeks ago, Josh shared a passage from Acts chapter 2 I'm going to share a similar one in Acts chapter 4 today as our jumping off point. So this is a recording of some of the very earliest church activity after Jesus had died and been resurrected and then ascended. Here's what we read the early church was up to. In Acts chapter 4, all the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. And God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all that there were no needy persons among them. From time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet. And it was distributed to anyone who had need. The early church was sharing so openly with one another that there was no one who had need, and yet anyone who had need knew that those needs would be shared and met within the context of this community. To say it a different way, in the early church, generosity wasn't just about material sharing. It wasn't just about finances and who had land and who sold what for how much. It wasn't just about material sharing. It was about breaking down barriers to create a community. Breaking down barriers to create a community. Doesn't that sound like what the church should be and gets to be all about? Isn't she lovely? So as we think about this today, I want us to wrestle with an idea that I'm taking from Tim Keller. He's a pastor and a theologian, and I've just really appreciated a lot of his writing and thinking on many subjects. But on this subject of the church's generosity, this is what Tim Keller writes. He says, "There's no more powerful evidence of the transformation of the gospel than radical generosity." He asks this question: how can our giving bring attention to Jesus instead of ourselves? How can our giving bring attention to Jesus instead of ourselves? That's the kind of giving that the early church was doing. The Lord was adding to their number because as people looked at this community, this beautiful example of blessing one another, giving and sharing, the world was attracted to who? Jesus, right? The local church was a beautiful example of something that the world wanted to be a part of, and that allowed the local church to be pointing toward Jesus. So our question for today, a little bit to wrestle with, is how can our giving bring more attention to Jesus than to ourselves? So as we jump in here this morning, I think one of the underlying questions as we're going to talk about generosity or giving is like, what underlies generosity? What is a basic thing that has to exist for generosity to exist? And I think a lot of us might answer that question with some version of the very basic idea that money or wealth somehow is underlying generosity, right? Like you can't give generously if it's not financial in some way, right? It would be a reasonable jumping off point. So let's dive in. Did you know that Forbes actually publishes a daily list of the real-time billionaires of the world? Seriously, it's online. You can look it up. It's a real-time list, and it's updated every day with the ups and downs depending on their portfolios, right, of how these billionaires' wealth is increasing or decreasing. So the real-time billionaires list as of Friday evening had these 8 individuals at the top of it. Some of these names you may recognize, others may be less familiar, but the number 1 billionaire right now in the world is Bernard Arnault and his family. He has several of his children involved. Do you know what Bernard Arnault, his sort of business entity is? Anybody know? Shout it out if you do. Anybody? Yeah, Louis Vuitton. That's right. So Louis Vuitton, Christian Dior, some of those luxury brands are sort of how the Arnault family has made its fortune. You also see up here Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, and of course Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Ellison, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer. These are all some of the billionaires rather, in the world. And so you might wonder, well, hey, how much is a billionaire like Bernard Arnault actually worth? You know, things we think about, right? Answer, the net worth of Bernard, the richest person in the world, currently sits at $220.9 billion. That's a lot of dollars. And if you're like me, which most of you probably are more like me than like Bernard, you haven't seen $220 billion in a while, or maybe ever. If that is you, by the way, and you have, we can talk after the service. Forget that thing I said about not holding onto your wallet. Okay, but since that's not most of us, we're going to look here, okay? What does $220.9 billion get you? If you divided that out among everybody in the world, we would all get a payout of about $28 a person, like every human on the planet, okay? That's one way to think about it. Or here's another way. You could buy 275 cruise ships, because why wouldn't you, at $8 million a pop. I mean, who doesn't need 275 cruise ships? Or, fun fact, that amount of money in $100 bills would roughly weigh the same as 200 school buses. Not kidding. Check my math. I think it's real, okay? This is a crazy amount of money. It's so much, like our brains can't really even get around it completely. And yet there is a lot of wealth in the world. So you might wonder, okay, with all that wealth in the world, if wealth is kind of an underpinning of generosity, well then what does it look like for the wealthiest people to be philanthropic? So those 8 people that are on this list, how philanthropic are they? Well, good news for all of us. Forbes also maintains a list of the top 25 most philanthropic billionaires. Here's what's crazy. Most of the 8 people, or however many go on that other list, don't actually show up on this other list, right? So wealth doesn't necessarily lead to being most generous. However, there are some wonderfully generous philanthropic billionaires, such as our friend Warren Buffett, or Bill and Melinda Gates, or over there, Mackenzie Scott, Jeff Bezos' ex-wife. And these people have all dedicated a significant amount of their wealth toward charitable, philanthropic causes. Okay, well, how much, you ask? The combined net worth of all of the people on this list of the top 25 most philanthropic billionaires, the combined net worth of that group is about $1.35 trillion, okay? So they have a lot of wealth from which to be generous. Generally speaking, however, so the top 25 as a group, their lifetime giving equals $211 billion. That's a lot, but if you think about percentages here, you start to see some of where I'm going with this, which is that, again, great wealth doesn't necessarily lead us toward great generosity without a lot of intention. However, these people, again, are doing some meaningful good in the world. They're attempting to be generous, right? And that's worthy of appreciation at the very least. Even the newcomers to the list, Mackenzie Scott was one of 4 new people who just made the list. They're finally on it. Woo! Top philanthropic billionaires. Even the 4 new people have contributed, okay? So $8 billion on this overall giving of this list this past year came from newcomers to the list, okay? So again, squad goals. Someday, find yourself on the top most philanthropic billionaire list. See what you can do. But here's the thing, okay? I asked people this week as I was prepping for this message, I asked people to think for me and to tell me without thinking too hard. I said, hey, name for me 2 or 3 of the most generous people you can think of. And you know what? They named some very interesting people, most of whom were not on this list or just up on that screen. Here, for example, the first person that I asked told me Daddy Warbucks was the first person that came to mind. And she then clarified and was like, did you mean real people? I was like, I mean Daddy Warbucks, Albert Finney, that's my version of Daddy Warbucks. We're going with that one, okay? So Daddy Warbucks comes to mind as a generous person. Who else came to mind? Well, Bill Gates actually came to mind for people quite a few times, which again, he shows up as someone who has both great wealth and has demonstrated a consistent pattern of philanthropy over his lifetime, things like humanitarian causes and sciences and medicine and things like that. Another one that was interesting, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast popped up a few times. Did you know he gave $100 million to charity in 2023? Like, okay, I get why he's on the top of some people's minds as an influencer who's using his philanthropy. Another one that came up a few different times, Dolly Parton. Dolly Parton has long had a philanthropic history of contributions to literacy and children's health care and really important kind of humanitarian, again, like emergency crisis kinds of causes. Dolly Parton came up a few different times as I asked people this question. And then there was a newcomer, another newcomer on our list, Miss Taylor Swift, right? As much as she's taken a ton of flack and been in the news for all of the money that the Eras Tour has raised or earned her, she just became a billionaire this year. I know, right? What's she been waiting for? So Taylor Swift, we've also seen a lot of news and interest stories around her philanthropy. She chooses to be generous in ways that are like immediate and in some way connected to the blessing of income that she's had, right? Fascinating. So these were the kinds of people that you guys named. And then this one also kept coming up. Mother Teresa. A number of people said that when they think of the top 2 or 3 most generous people that they can think of, Mother Teresa comes to mind. Now, I'm dating myself here, but Sesame Street used to have a game that they would play. Sesame Street, it's a TV show, don't worry about it. So Sesame Street used to have a game they would play, and the game was, one of these things is not like the others, right? Do you remember one of these things is not like, okay, Mother Teresa. One of these things is not like the others. While those others certainly had lots of material wealth and possessions to share, that was what we think of when we think of their generosity, Mother Teresa lived a life of near poverty. She served people, right, first through soup kitchens in Calcutta and in India, and then around the world, eventually establishing homes that were meant for people who were dying of leprosy or HIV and AIDS. Like, Mother Teresa's impact wasn't fueled by her wealth, but she still tops a lot of our thinking as a generous example. Fascinating, right? Interestingly, her ministry eventually became the kind of charitable entity that was taking in millions of dollars every year. At one point, I believe the total was about $15 million a year that they were then able to put back into the charitable work, the charitable mission of that organization. So while Mother Teresa herself wasn't a millionaire, billionaire, whatever, she was the kind of person whose actions were inspiring other people to want to give and make a difference through the ministries that she was a part of. See, Mother Teresa showed us this awesome truth, which is that radical generosity looks a lot like radical unselfishness. Radical generosity looks like radical unselfishness, right? It was her spirit of giving and serving others that was the thing that was most noticeable. It wasn't about how much money she could give. It was about what did her spirit of radical generosity look like. And in her case, a really great example of radical unselfishness. There's a book that came out several years ago by a guy named Randy Alcorn. It's called The Treasure Principle. And one of the things that Randy says in this book applies, I think, to this idea or example that Mother Teresa gives us. He says, God prospers me not to raise my standard of living, but to raise my standard of giving, right? It's always nice when they rhyme. God prospers me not to raise my standard of living, but to raise my standard of giving. In other words, the blessings I've been given aren't all for me just to make my life better, easier, smoother, whatever, but to raise my standard of giving. If I've been given more, I have more opportunity to bless others. Like, that's what God is up to. When we look at some examples again in the life of the early church, there's a letter that Paul, one of Jesus' early apostles and early church fathers, wrote. He wrote this letter to Timothy. Timothy was leading the development of the church at Ephesus. And just like any church, isn't she lovely? Also, she had problems and challenges and people that were making things messy. Of course she did. But the church at Ephesus, among other things, was being cautioned in one of Paul's letters to think about the way they were approaching generosity. Not because they didn't have enough, but because what they had and how they were going to use it mattered. And so here's what Paul writes to Timothy. We're going to pick up on that and I think be able to take away some for ourselves as well. Paul says this in 1 Timothy chapter 6, breaking in at verse 17. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Pause there for just a second. God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. In other words, God wants us to enjoy wealth and pleasure. Literally, the premise of this verse is command those who are rich, as in being rich, having wealth, having comfort, not a bad thing. Sometimes I think we get into like the Christian folklore section of our brains and we're like, Jesus didn't like wealth. No, Jesus had us be cautious about wealth because of what that could mean. But Jesus or God aren't inherently against wealth, right? It's a matter of how we think about it. So this verse is a great example, a starting point. Command those who are rich, okay? So God richly provides with everything for our enjoyment. He says, command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. It goes on. In this way, they will lay up treasures for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. See, in this passage, Paul reminds us God's not against wealth. He's not against the storing up of treasures even, but the matter of how we're laying up these treasures, laying up treasures that are an investment toward the future of all eternity, like that your giving would matter, that it would have eternal significance is the hope that Paul has here. Let me sum it up for us a couple quick ways, right? Just looking at this passage, he's encouraging us to practice hope in God. Practice hope in God. What does that look like? See, when we have to hope in God, it means that we're going to trust God for something we can't just do or get ourselves. It means that as we take stock of those abundant resources and pleasures that we have, we actually give credit to God, right? And we're thinking about that in the way that like, hey, I'm gonna even trust God with my finances, right? That can be a huge step, and it's one that a lot of us as disciples of Jesus constantly revisit to keep working and growing in that area. But practice hope in God is one of his jumping off points. And he says, in this way, here's how we can do that. By doing good. Be rich in good deeds. Be generous. Be willing to share. That's the recipe for what it looks like, right? Practice hope in God in this way. He's pretty specific. So these are some things to consider. And finally, that key point, like I mentioned before, do this. Why? For eternal gain. Let there be some eternal significance to the way that you're choosing to invest, not just your generosity in finances, but your generosity in time and care and relationship and all those kinds of things. But practice your hope in God by trusting him even more and by leaning into what opportunities you have to do good and to be willing to share or be generous, right, for eternal good. Again, a reminder that radical generosity looks like radical unselfishness. Again, Randy Alcorn says this. He says, God doesn't have a limited store of treasures. You storing them up for yourself doesn't reduce them for anyone else. Everyone gains. No one loses, right? Go ahead. Store up more heavenly treasures. Invest more in the kingdom of God. Share more. Be more generous. Knock yourself out. You're not going to outgive God and his abundance for you. You're just not, right? Everyone gains when we're more generous. Everyone gains. No one loses. It's not a competition where like you got some points and so he didn't. No, everyone gains in the kingdom mindset that God is encouraging us to take on. All right, so generosity sounds good. Most of us agree with it as a premise. So here's a hard question. Why aren't we more generous? Why aren't we more generous? Think about that for a second. I'm going to take us down a road here, but you can think about your own answer here too, okay? Why aren't we more generous? And you might think, well, hey, Audrey, I'm just really not a billionaire. Fine. However, we talked about that already, right? The billionaire dollars, the dollar amount doesn't have to be the thing that really influences the impact of our generosity. You could have very little and still be a beautiful picture of generosity, right? So maybe you're not a billionaire, fair. Why aren't we more generous? Well, hey, you know what? I'm actually just trying to make it paycheck to paycheck. Or heck, I don't even have a paycheck to be worrying about right now. I've lost my job and I'm just at a point where I am relying on God's goodness. Well, you know what? That's awesome, because to be generous and to be in that mind and heart space of relying on God is an awesome step in your faith journey with God, right? Who truly wants to provide for you. I believe that. And so if you're somebody who's thinking, I'm limited in my generosity, that's okay. You can think that through. But what does it still look like to share or be generous in some ways? Because the teachings of Jesus and what we've seen in Paul's writings aren't just specific to the billionaires, right? They can be applicable for all of us, I think. And so here's an underlying thing. Why aren't we more generous? We don't think we're greedy. we don't think we're greedy, right? When you came in here this morning, you weren't like, I'm working on a lot of things, and my greed is probably one of them. For most of us, that's not a thing that we're thinking of top of mind. But here's the uncomfortable thing I want you to think about for a minute. Are you a little bit greedy? According to Jesus' standard and concern, I think all of us have the potential to fall into some greed in just the way we think about things, right? And so I want to take you to a particular moment where Jesus was teaching. And he shared a parable because Jesus was concerned that we were going to be greedy. He saw it in his culture and his time, and we can see it in ours, and it doesn't always look like you would expect. So I'm going to take you to a parable that Jesus taught in the Gospel of Luke. It's recorded. He was talking with a rich young man who had started out with a question about dividing his inheritance. And Jesus basically said, that doesn't really matter. But check this out. Here's where Jesus broke in. Then he said to them, watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. He's like, hey, so much harvest. I don't even have room for all this stuff. This is amazing. What am I going to do? I've got so many crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. In other words, your crops did great. So much crops, you can't even fit them in your barns. What should you do? Knock down the little barns, build bigger barns, and now chill out because you've done awesome. That's what this guy is thinking. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. And then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. Jesus cautions right at the beginning of this message that he shares, right? Watch out for all kinds of greed. Is it greedy for this man to just be like, woo, I've got it made, so many crops, let's build more barns and have a party? And Jesus is like, yeah, watch out for that. Because if it's all about you, you have missed an opportunity to be rich toward God in how you might have shared or invested that toward others. Right? This is kind of what he's talking about. I think two major generosity pitfalls are what we can see in this parable. So the first, we're going to call the consumption assumption, all right? If it came to me, it's for me. That's the consumption assumption. That's this guy's starting point, which honestly sounds pretty reasonable. Like, hey, my crops did great. I'm grateful for that. I'm going to receive it. I'm going to live and enjoy my life because of it. That doesn't sound crazy, does it? Like, that sounds pretty typical, especially if we think about our Americanized context, right? Where what we earn, we've worked really hard for. And isn't it nice to have the acknowledgement or be the recipient of blessings or of material success when we know we've worked hard for a thing? If it came to me, it's for me. There's a danger in that. The consumption assumption can be one of the ways that sometimes our greed can be a little sneaky. Because the question to ask is that true? If it came to you, it's literally from God. One way or another, right? You earned it, sure, you worked for it, but God has blessed you with it. So there's a different way to see even our own material accomplishments. Here's another generosity pitfall. The worship of worry. The worship of worry is a cycle we get ourselves into where we think that our greater levels of stress will one day have a payoff of greater levels of success, which will lead us to feel a greater level of security, however you may choose to define that, or comfort, right? That more of my stress, more of my sense of worth and accomplishment coming from that, leading toward my success, leading toward then my security. We get in a cycle of worry where, in fact, instead of worshiping God and relying on Him and trusting in Him, we get ourselves in the place where we're worshiping worry. The thing we're really thinking about all the time is how we're making ends meet, how we're reaching that next financial milestone, how we're doing that next best thing that we want to be doing. Again, that's not always bad. But a caution around that, right? A caution around that is that can be a warning sign of the greed in our lives that Jesus is asking us to be mindful of. Watch out. If you find yourself in a cycle of worry, is that impeding your sense of unselfishness and generosity? It may be. Jesus boils it down to this really simple idea. He tells us that we need to be rich toward God. And throughout the Gospels, we read kind of the fullness of this idea that we need to be rich. We have an opportunity to be rich toward God by doing for others as Christ did for us. If you're a Jesus follower and you've chosen to accept Jesus because you recognize the amazing, gracious, abundant beyond all belief kind of generosity that his self-sacrificial love meant for you when he died on the cross, if you recognize that and you've placed your trust in Jesus to follow after him, my goodness, your generosity isn't some obedience that God commands. It's not what God wants from you, we say, right? It's what God wants for you. That you have an opportunity to do for others as Christ did for you, and in that way you can be rich toward God. I want to share a story with you about this man. This man wasn't named by anybody I asked this week to tell me about one of the top 2 or 3 most generous people they could think of. He wasn't on this past year's list of wealthiest individuals in the world or in the United States. His name is Chuck Feeney, and he passed away this past November at the age of 92. And Chuck Feeney was, in fact, one of the wealthiest men of our modern day and one of the greatest philanthropists as well. In fact, when he died, several of his friends put together a video to sort of share Chuck Feeney's story. And it's really short, and I would love for you to take a look and see, as we start this video, the first voice that you'll hear is none other than his friend, Bill Gates. Let's take a look.
Chuck Feeney was an energetic entrepreneur, created a lot of companies until he got to duty-free shopping, which was so successful that when he sold it, he ended up with over $1 billion that he put into an offshore philanthropy called Atlantic Philanthropies.
The idea of becoming a billionaire could be kind of empty unless there is a purpose that the funds are used for. I'm not here to tell anybody what they should do with their money, but I'm just convinced that the satisfaction one can achieve from helping people is a level of satisfaction that you can't get otherwise.
For a long time, he did all his giving anonymously.
It was by 1980 that I started thinking, where's all this leading and what am I going to do with it? You know, I'm a guy who said that I could be happy with a grilled cheese and tomato sandwich.
He decided to give it all away. Overall, more than $8 billion went into charitable causes.
The opportunity of doing it as you realize it's happening and that you're responsible for some part of making it happen.
He found high-impact gifts and gave very low visibility, although he eventually decided that having a book about what he did would encourage other philanthropists, and so we can read his life story.
As you sit in the world and you look around you and say, well, why would you reduce the amount of good you can do if there's a lot of good that's required? There's no shortage of people who need help. That's a market that will always exist.
Chuck set a wonderful example.
Chuck set a wonderful example. Chuck wasn't actually a Jesus follower. He talked about his faith and basically said he had grown up with a Roman Catholic background, and he thought that some of the ethics of Christianity were kind of worth following. But you guys, at his heart, Chuck wasn't motivated by a deep love for Jesus. He was simply motivated by the opportunity he had to make a difference. He was motivated by what he talked about as his philosophy of giving while living. In other words, like, I don't want to wait till I'm dead. I want to give while I'm alive. And in fact, like they said, he set this goal of giving away his entire fortune by the time before he died, right? He wanted to be the kind of philanthropist who could see his investments making a difference. This mattered a lot to him. And when he passed away, Bill Gates came up with and wrote an article about 4 specific ways that he thought Chuck Feeney was a really amazing example of philanthropy. And here's the thing. I think there are some things we can consider as the church in looking at an example like Chuck Feeney. So here's the first thing. He was totally dedicated to giving away everything he had, right? He was totally dedicated to this. By the time he passed away, he and his wife were living in a rented apartment. He went from having $8 billion worth to giving all of that away to various kinds of philanthropic organizations with the intention that he could just be satisfied with a grilled cheese and tomato sandwich, right? He was a simple kind of guy, and that's our second one. He started humble, and he stayed humble. He was born at the edge of the Great Depression to a pretty common family in New Jersey. He put himself through college on the GI Bill. And eventually he had this blazing success with duty-free shops. Those shops in the airports, that was his business idea, okay? That's where he made his millions, his billions. But he started humble and he stayed humble. The third thing was that he was passionate about philanthropy. He was truly passionate about the impact and the outcomes that his generosity could have. And as a result, he contributed to significant social kinds of things. So for example, he was a major contributor that helped overhaul Vietnam's healthcare system at one point. He played an instrumental role in the Northern Ireland peace agreement that was reached because, again, he was investing in things and he was passionate. The other thing that I think is fascinating is that for many years, as he started giving his money away, he gave it away anonymously, right? Very humble in that. And yet, at a point in time, what he recognized was that as a philanthropist, he had the opportunity to influence and inspire others if he could share more about what he was doing, right? So he didn't share what he was doing to get a bunch of attention for himself. He shared in order to inspire others to greater philanthropy. Bill and Melinda Gates, for example, are among a group of very wealthy people who've signed something called the Giving Pledge, by which they have pledged to give away 50% of their net worth by the end of their lives. Charles Feeney was like an inspiration behind that kind of giving pledge, and they talked about it, right? Because he really wanted to encourage others. He was passionate that philanthropy was one of the ways he could have meaning and impact in this life. And then finally, he was effective. Like I mentioned, the charities that Charles Feeney supported were meaningful. And he could see the impact as he continued to give, right, through education and medicine, and again, a variety of things. But he could see and measure that his giving was making an impact. So as we think about the local church, isn't she lovely? With no disrespect or disadmiration, if that's a word, to somebody like Chuck Feeney, who was not a Jesus follower motivated in that way toward his giving, with no disrespect to that. The world shouldn't outgive Christians. Isn't she lovely? The church, Jesus' church, should be the most generous expression of our unselfishness and our blessing of others that we could possibly even imagine. I'm grateful that people like Chuck Feeney and the Gateses and others have made amazing investments, right? But I'm just as grateful for people who are serving and will never be seen or talked about from a stage. Or for people who are choosing to give generously despite whatever their income level may be because they are sacrificially and beautifully deciding to help others in some sort of way. Isn't she lovely? The church at its most beautiful should never be outgiven by just the world, right? Because we have the most amazing starting point in Jesus' love and example to us. Again, I'm going to go back to Tim Keller because I love the way he says it. He says, in a world where philanthropists give away millions to charitable causes, how generous would ordinary Christians have to be to catch the attention of the world? How generous would ordinary Christians have to be? That's us. That's you and me. That's Verve City Church. That's the church, right? Imagine what God could do if the church acted together to unleash generous blessings in our communities and around the world. Isn't she lovely? That's the picture that we get to walk toward as we choose to follow Jesus and as we choose to be part of a local church community. Imagine if. Will you pray with me? Dear Heavenly Father, We're so thankful for who you are, and we're thankful for your son, Jesus. God, as we consider all that you've given us, we're just grateful. And literally just a heart of gratitude is what I want to express this morning in terms of the ways that you have blessed me and my family, that you've blessed so many of us, God. We're thankful for who you are and how you've provided for us. And God, as we look around at the world and we look around at this question of radical generosity, what would it look like for you to just be in this with us, God? We ask that you would be continuing to bless us and to bless others through us, God, because we want to point them to you. More than anything, we want to bring glory and honor to you. We want to point people to know Jesus. God, what a privilege it is to walk and to carry your light into the world. And God, may you just please work in the hearts and minds of those hearing in my voice this morning, God, just that you would be filling us up with a sense of your direction, your purpose, your Holy Spirit-inspired purpose. God, we give everything to you in Jesus' name.